So this is going to be a little different. Like I said, this is going to be a little different. I am actually sitting down and doing an interview. This is the first interview I've done as part of this series, and I am sitting down with Dr. Jake Milne. He is a professor and actually the chair of the Sociology, Anthropology, and Criminology department here at Longwood, and the reason I'm sitting down with him is I'm hoping to get a more sort of scientific, certainly sociological perspective on what it is that really compels people to seek out small towns, to live in small towns, and what they sort of have to offer, and maybe some of the things that I can expect as I go through this process. When we said, let's just cut ahead to the interview, yeah? So, first of all, Dr. Milne, thank you for sitting down with me.
Absolutely.
I want to apologize about my notes here. I'm not a super experienced interviewer.
You are fine.
Since you are the first person that I'm sort of sitting down with to talk about these issues, or this project really, I kind of feel like I should probably explain it a little more than I did when I reached out.
Okay.
This whole thing started because I read an article about Colin Woodard's book, American Nations, which is a history of the 11 rival regional cultures in North America, which are still sort of at play in the way that things work in our country. At least that's the idea, right?
Okay.
And that article spawned the question in my mind that if there really are all these, I mean, he calls them rival cultures at play, is it really possible for us to be sort of one country, one culture, right? And so that sort of started the wheels turning. And the reason that I'm focusing on small towns as I go across the country and talk to people is really sort of twofold. And it's one of those things, I think, based on my experience growing up in small towns and things like that, small towns have a very strong communal identity in of themselves. There is something, somehow small towns inherently have this idea of we're kind of all in this together and we're doing a thing. At least that's what I hope I'm going to find.
Okay.
And then that sort of feeds the second point of, because I believe small towns have these very strong communal identities, I think that will make it easier to answer the questions of what are our differences and what do we have in common as I go across. Because if every place I go has a very strong identity, I think it'll be easier to pick out those things that make us different and make us the same.
I understand. Okay. 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 I'm trying to play with some different ideas as we go through this, so we may stumble through this one here a little bit.
That's totally fine.
Fair enough.
Are you ready to go?
Bring it on.
All right. So sort of starting off here, I've got to admit, I apologize, I didn't do as much research about you as I probably should have. But you are from a small town, Haymarket, Virginia, right?
That is correct.
Which 2010 was like 1,800 people?
I believe that sounds about right. It was pre the kind of suburban boom that has happened in the 2010s. Okay. As the Washington, D.C. area has grown and just absolutely kind of bursted with population, many people moving back towards Washington, D.C. and into the suburb areas. People are commuting longer, and so Haymarket has become a suburb, I would argue, of the Washington, D.C. area. So over about the past 10 years. Really, it probably started about the mid-2000s, but really has kind of really bursted since then.
So what was it like growing up in a small town like that, sort of in the shadow of D.C.?
Sure. So I'll give you a little bit more of my backstory, if that also helps. So I was actually originally born and lived the first 3 years of my life in Reston, Virginia, which Reston is right beside Dulles Airport, if you're looking at that. So, and my parents decided that when I was 3 or 4, so that would have been 1980, 81, I believe it was 81 when we moved out to Haymarket, that my father wanted some land. And so he moved us out to Bull Run Mountain, which is a part of Haymarket. Haymarket is actually geographically pretty big. And so he moved us out there, brought some land at the base of Bull Run Mountain. And so I grew up there. And I loved the fact that I had a lot of places to go outside and play. As a very active child, we had the 6 acres, plus we had a whole 6 acres plus in the back area where I would just go out and play. And my brother and I, so I have a younger brother who 2 years younger than me, and I would just spend most of our summers just outside roaming around the mountain. So it's well known that on the eastern part of Bull Run Mountain is the public side, and the western part of Bull Run Mountain is the government-owned side of the mountain. So it's pretty well known. But we spend a lot of time outdoors. But then I'm a sports guy, and sport is still a huge part of my life. And so we're starting at about the late 70s, really, but the beginning of the late 60s into the 70s, and certainly has gained popularity by the late 70s, early 80s, is the youth sport movement. And so I was very much part of that youth sport movement, playing soccer at Long Park. That was my life growing up, is we would play soccer. We would get up, and I was lucky my father was my coach for much of my life growing up. So having that experience, and then also Boy Scouts. So I was a Boy Scout, and growing up in that type of a system as well, where we gained a lot of our community, if you will.
Okay.
So,
moving forward, sort of quickly here, I guess.
Sure.
Your undergrad experience was actually at Longwood in Farmville,
that is
right?
correct. Longwood College.
Longwood College. Was there any major shift in the way that you sort of thought about life moving from a town? I mean, really only looking at demographics as far as what was reported recently, it's not that big of a jump in size, but it is a little bit.
Yeah, so when I was in Haymarket, so I lived in Haymarket from 1981 to when I left for college in 1995. And so during that time, Haymarket was a small town. In many respects, I can't speak necessarily to the actual demographics of it, but coming to Farmville wasn't much of a change. I mean, even in names, Farmville, Haymarket.
Haymarket.
Yeah, Haymarket. Not much of a difference in change of names. So what changed for me was the increase in the number of people who were my age. So what I also should say a little bit about Haymarket is that because of the rural nature of Haymarket, I actually ended up going to high school in Manassas. Okay. So I graduated from Stonewall Jackson. I realize they're changing that name now, but I went to Stonewall Jackson High School in Manassas. But most of my friends were actually in Manassas. Okay. And so, but most of my soccer friends, my Boy Scout friends, were out of Haymarket, if you will. So I was able to kind of see, I guess you could say I could see those two, I won't call them rival communities. They certainly were not rival, but they were two different styles of communities. One, certainly the small town feel where you knew people and you knew about people. Whereas in Manassas, you knew people, but you didn't necessarily know about people and what their lives were like. Okay. So I would say that was kind of one of the biggest differences. But then coming here to Farmville, I mean, in the late 90s, I think we were still somewhere about, what was it? When the students arrived, we doubled the population of Farmville. And I still think that's
still almost happens, yeah.
True today. So it really wasn't much of a difference other than more people my age.
Okay.
So, yep.
What about the shift going then to like grad school.
Yeah.
Columbia and then Blacksburg for your master's and doctoral degrees.
So that was really interesting. And what was great about grad school for me was that I actually was able to retain a lot of the small town feel within grad school. The reason being is that grad school, the way it was structured, at least for me in sociology, was that your community were your cohort of students. Now, yes, there was a more dense population. People were living closer together. But my community, the people who I knew, were really a small group of people in that setting. And I think that that's actually one of the things you see with a lot of urban areas, is that people create that community. There may be some branching out to some larger social networks, but people have a very small central community of people who they hang out with on a day-to-day basis. So that, for me, even going to Blacksburg and Columbia, which were certainly Columbia was a major metropolitan area for South Carolina, we had the amenities of being able to go down to the local bar or something like that, which we certainly didn't really have here in Farmville. We had more, let's say this, we had more of those amenities in Columbia than we did here in Farmville, and certainly in Blacksburg as well. But we still had our community of people, our tight group of people who knew each other, whose lives were intersecting on a day-to-day basis.
This is a question that I probably should have asked before, but when did sociology enter the picture? When did you decide that studying cultures and society was what you wanted to do?
That's a great question. I love telling the story. So I started at Longwood in '95 as a therapeutic recreation major. Okay, so therapeutic recreation, individuals who use sport to help individuals with disabilities. Made sense. I'm hearing impaired, and with your strong connection to sports growing up. It made perfect sense. So I studied that, and I got in, and I was like, okay, this is fun, but I didn't have the heart for it. It just didn't seem right. And so at the beginning of my sophomore year, I took Sociology 101 with Ken Perkins. Okay, and the material just resonated, and Ken and I had conversations at that time, and I was like, Dr. Perkins, I love sport. What's the connection here? And he's like, what do you want to do your paper on for your intro to social? I'm like, I don't know. He's like, why don't you do it on something rather than sport? And I looked at him and said, I can do that? And he said, absolutely. And so I started delving into the literature about the social aspects of sport, and it just made sense. And that really kind of spurred on, even to what I do today. I consider myself what we call social psychologist, as well as a sport guy, and study sport and study the organization of sport, and really study why people get into sport, and then also why people drop out of sport too. Okay. So sociology came as a result of taking a class and just loving the material. It made sense. When I read the information, it made sense to me, and I said, huh. And then my parents asked me, well, what do you do with a sociology degree? And I said, well, the thing was, I always knew I kind of wanted to teach. Mm-hmm. And then I quickly realized that there was no way I could ever teach little people together. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Yep.
So, grew up in Haymarket,
mm-hmm.
college Longwood,
mm-hmm.
grad school in Columbia, and then Virginia Tech.
Yep.
What brought you back to Farmville?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I tell this story often that there is probably not a month that goes by where I have a conversation with my father. And my dad will send me regular job adverts for jobs up in the Washington, D.C. area. And I look at him and I say, I'll use the PG version, you are out of your mind if you think I'm coming back to the Washington, D.C. area. He says, why? It's like, Dad, things are too fast up there for me. And he's like, okay, I get that. But they're good jobs. I'm like, they are great jobs, but I got a great job here. And I've got a lot of people here who care about not just me, but they care about my family. They want to see both me be successful as well as my family be successful. And that mattered a lot. Knowing that there were people here who I knew coming back, because by that time I had been, real quickly, a little background. After my master's degree in Columbia, I came back and I taught here for a year as a lecturer before I went on to Virginia Tech for 4 years. And then it was in 2006 that I was lucky enough to land the job. And part of that job was the luck. A job came open, I applied, and I was very lucky to get that position. But I always knew there were a couple things about Longwood. One, I always knew I wanted to teach. I don't mind doing research, but it's not my bread and butter, if you will. And so I wanted a school like a Longwood where teaching was what you were expected to do, more so than the research. Again, I like doing research, the specific type of research that I do, but it's not my priority as compared to the teaching. So Longwood made sense. I wanted something that was close to both my parents and my wife's parents. So my wife's parents live in Williamsburg. So we got 2 hours east versus 3 hours north up to my parents. So it was a relatively close area for us. But we also knew we didn't want to be in the hustle and bustle of Northern Virginia. I grew, and some of it is as simple as I did not want to deal with the traffic. I love the fact that Farmville has what we call rush minute. Okay, we have a rush minute here versus the rush day up in Northern Virginia. My father works in Leesburg, which is the town that's about 20 minutes, could be 20 minutes away from Haymarket. And he says it takes him about 40 minutes to get to work. I'm like, that doesn't make any sense to me. I can't imagine sitting in a car for all that time.
40 minutes one way.
40 minutes one way. It doesn't make any sense to me. So again, some of it's as simple as traffic. Some of it is as simple as I don't get that sense. We're talking about community. I don't get that sense of connection with people in Northern Virginia that I have had down here in Farmville. We've been lucky to develop some great connections with a lot of different people. I really kind of a diaspora of people that I don't think I'd ever have that up in Northern Virginia. I think unfortunately Northern Virginia suffers from the homogeneity effect, where people tend to live in areas that are very homogeneous, based upon things like social class, race, etc. And so those boundaries really are much more explicit up in the Northern Virginia area than they are here in Farmville. Yes, we know that we can see some of the social class boundaries, but I think that some of those boundaries are a little less apparent, and you can cross those boundaries pretty easily to develop that community. And I like that. I like that I can know people whose families I know make $30,000 or less a year, but I also know folks and families whose families make over $200,000 a year. And those folks actually interact with each other, more so than I think that they would up in Northern Virginia. So, yeah.
So this is sort of an opinion question.
Okay.
And I think I kind of can sort of begin to formulate what I think your answer is going to be based off some of the things we've talked about. But as I do this, and as I go and I visit these communities, what do you think it is that keeps small towns from just sort of drying up?
Absolutely.
And so I guess the short question there is, what are small town strengths?
Yep. And
then also I kind of want to give equal time the opposite side there. What are the weaknesses of small towns? Where do they fall short?
Sure. Let's start with the strengths. I think the strengths of small towns are their ability to generate community through specific social institutions. Okay, so again, as a sociologist, we deal with these ideas called social institutions, things like the family, education, media, sport, religion. One of the things that small towns are able to do really well is generate community through those social institutions, but bring that diaspora of people together into that one. So For example, PEFYA, Prince Edward Farmville Youth Association, the sport league in this town, has children who play those sports from a variety of different backgrounds, okay? And they do that well. I think they really do that well, whether it's, their focus at PEFYA is on baseball and basketball, with a little bit of soccer, but they bring together people who normally up in Northern Virginia would be separated in these larger urban and suburban areas. They would be separated from each other. Small town communities are almost forced to have those institutions together, okay? So I think you've got that. You also have small town businesses that really also do the same thing. They bring that diaspora people, because these places like, for example, Uptown Coffee, you go into Uptown and any day of the week and you've got people of all shapes, sizes, creeds, everything else, and they're all in this one place. Whereas you go to a place like in Northern Virginia, the restaurants are very homogenous, in at least how I see it. So I think that's one of the things that small towns do well, is that they use their social institutions to bring those people together. Something as simple as things like First Fridays that we put on here in Farmville. We haven't been able to do it this year because of COVID, but First Fridays is really, really cool when it's down there by the Appomattox River. You go down there, you've got the blow up, inflatable bouncy houses, and you've got people from all different walks of life just down there enjoying just a wonderful mix of music, from bluegrass to R&B I've heard out there. So I think that those are the types of things that are really, really important. And then things like the festivals that a lot of small towns put on are really, really important. And I think that, for example, this is why we really missed Heart of Virginia this year. Now I know Heart of Virginia's seen a little bit of a decline in attendance recently, in terms of vendors, I think. But it's still important, because people say, oh, first weekend in May, that's Heart of Virginia weekend. That's something as a community, you could say, that's who we are.
Yep.
Okay? That's who we are. And so in terms of what they do well, and you've talked about the social institution, we also talk about the other thing that matters for communities are the symbols of the small town. What represents a small town? And so for a place like Farmville, you think Farmville, you might think Longwood, you might think Hampton-Sydney, but you're also starting to think about things like the High Bridge Trail, okay? Or Greenfront. When people think Farmville, the small town, they might think Greenfront furniture. That's a symbol of our town. I think that small towns that are really successful are able to do those two things, and that is have those social institutions like the sporting institutions that bring people together, but also really use their symbols to help highlight who they are, and really create an identity around that. I'll give you an example from my own travels. Cody, Wyoming is a really fascinating town. I love that town. It's completely different from anything I have ever experienced. So we drove through Cody last summer on our way back from Yellowstone, and we stayed a night in Cody, and it happened to be, and we did not realize that every night they do the rodeo. the Cody Stampede, which is really, really popular. Okay,
it's a deal.
And it's a big deal, but that is well known. And so I took my son and we went down to the Cody Stampede, and we loved it, absolutely loved it. And I'm looking around the stands, and again, there's you could tell who are the tourists,
yep.
Us, versus the townsfolks. But you can tell that this mattered a lot for people in the town, because you had so many businesses who were advertising there. And I can tell you, the riders probably weren't making a lot off of their experience, but that mattered to them. Having that Cody Stampede, no matter what. So that was something they could hang their identity. And then the Buffalo Bill icon, which I found out was a really big part of their identity. Those types of symbols matter a lot to people in the town. And so, being able to, frankly, small towns that are able to capitalize on those, to wrap their identities around, their collective identities around those, I think are good. You ask people about Farmville, and they usually say, oh, Farmville, that's where Greenfront is, okay? So that's part of our identity, but then, again, using things like the High Bridge Trail and the High Bridge as part of that identity really are things that help solidify, I think, that identity for the community.
With those strengths,
Yeah.
are there any inherent weaknesses that exist in small towns?
I do. Unfortunately, there are. And I think from a family perspective, from someone who grew up in a town that was, by the time I was leaving, starting to suburbanize, and we could get to a grocery store within about 5 minutes, or we can get to a lot of amenities within a pretty quick time. That, I think, is one of the things that lacks. And I've said this to a number of my friends, that I love the things that Farmville does, but there are just some things that I really want from my son that we have to go out of town for. If we want to go to do any sort of major science thing, we got to go to Richmond or Northern Virginia or some place like that. So, having those types of opportunities at times can be tough for some small towns. Something as simple as food options. We have a lot of fast food options in this town, but you go to our grocery stores and our grocery stores are limited in their options. So if you're looking to branch out your palate, it can be difficult unless you travel to Richmond or travel to Lynchburg or Charlottesville to get some of those amenities. So I think those types of things are the things that frustrate families. Where on the weekends, I'll say this, my son is not a big sports guy, which pains me, but he's not a big sports guy. And so on the weekends, I'm always looking for something for him to do. And we have things like the LCVA, which are great opportunities, but you can only do that so often.
Yeah.
And so you want to be able to go over to the Science Museum or go do these different activities that we just don't have in a small town. But it is a sacrifice, and you understand that when you come to a place like a Farmville or a Cody, Wyoming, or any place like that. I think you have to understand that. I will also give you one other, and that is from talking with other friends. It's a really difficult. Small towns are really difficult for finding relationships. They're tough on single people. They're really, really tough on single people. Your market is fairly small. It really is. And so, if you're single in a small town, generally I hear a lot of folks say, yeah, usually if I'm going on a date, I've found someone like Richmond or Lynchburg. I'm going. So I would say that's a tough part too.
So the last question I've got for
Yep.
you, and this is another one of those sort of nebulous questions, and I apologize for that.
Bring it.
As this evolves, this project, and as I go out and I visit these communities, the whole purpose of this project is to find those things that we have in common, so that we can answer the question of, can we really be one culture as we're separated out? As I go throughout the country, especially with all the things that are happening right now,
Sure.
am I going to find more similarities, or am I going to find more differences? I'm not asking you to solve the problem if there's more differences, but just sort of what do you expect is going to be the case?
I'll go back to what I was talking about earlier with symbols. You're going to find differences in the symbols that communities use to rally around, but they're still rallying around a symbol that matters to them, that reflects their value systems of that community. So, again, we know, for example, here in Farmville, people believe in education. We've rallied around those institutions of education, whether not just Longwood and Hampton Sydney, but the Moton School. That has become a part of things that matter to us. So I don't know if you'll necessarily find, for example, that we use the same type of symbols as other communities, but all communities are using those type of symbols that reflect a value system. I think that one thing you will find is a value system that reflects a work ethic. I think that's something that you see a lot in small towns, is this ideology, this idea of the hard work ethic. And you'll see that in how people display what matters to them in terms of, for example, you go, okay, here we go. You run into just about any small town, one of the things you see on the entrance sign is state champions in wrestling, okay? Or state champion in football. That's something you often see as you drive into a town. What that reflects is that an ideology of there's a sport that we are good at, but that we've worked hard at, okay? So I think that hard work ethic, that hard work, kind of that meritocratic ethic, hard work equals success, is something you're going to find that small towns are going to try and highlight. I think. Okay. Yeah. Let's go with that one. So.
Like it.
So.
Well, Dr. Milne, thank you again
Absolutely.
for sitting down with me. You've certainly given me some thinking points as I go through and sort of develop
Great.
what I'm looking for as I'm going out, and this is going to be very, very exciting.
I am really excited to see what you find on your trip. If I may ask, do you have an idea of your route at this point?
So not yet.
Okay.
So the planned start date for this is June of 21.
June. Okay, June 21. I got it.
So actually, the idea is that I'm going to spend the next year sort of talking to people and gathering information about what I should be doing and where I should be going.
Gotcha.
And then in next June, so a year from now, I'm actually going to then, the idea is take off and drive around. And at that point, I will hopefully have some kind of route planned.
Gotcha.
I'm thinking what's going to happen is I'm actually going to go, I don't have towns picked out yet, obviously. But the idea, I think, is going to be I'm going to go south first and then come back, probably down to like Florida area, and then back north and then west. I mean, the idea is that I want to hit as many places as possible. And so do sort of a weird outline of the country loop that goes down the coast and then back into sort of like the mid south area,
Okay.
places like Louisiana and stuff like that. And then
Gotcha.
and then it's Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas. That area, and then all the way as far west as California. Hopefully, we'll see.
Yeah.
It all comes down to how much time I have and when I can get there. But
I'll ask.
and then back around up by coming north and then back down.
Gotcha. So what you just said gave me one other thing that just kind of popped in my brain, something for you to potentially consider. So there's a metaphor that we use in sociology called the cultural iceberg, okay? And that is that essentially our behaviors, if you think about an iceberg, the tip of the iceberg is like your behaviors, how you act, if you will. Everything under the iceberg are things like your belief systems, your attitudes. But a couple of things that come to mind are geography and climate. Those have a tremendous effect on how small towns conduct their day-to-day life. So for example, Fargo, North Dakota, you can imagine that their winter months, the small town community is probably more centralized in the family. Versus maybe down in the southern part of the United States, it is, let's all get together. In the summer months, we're all sitting around, very relaxed, very chill, not a lot of physical activity because it's bloody hot down in the south, okay? So climate matters a lot in terms of how people generate that community. Climate and geography matter a lot. I can think that how you do it in the mining towns of West Virginia, it's going to be completely different from how you do it in, the western part of Connecticut, upstate Pennsylvania, or upstate New York, which up near the lakes, how does the lake all affect that? So I think climate and geography are going to play a role in how they do that as well.
Okay.
So.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Cool.
Any closing thoughts?
Good luck. That sounds like fun. I'm looking forward to I hope you carry a little GPS or have some way that people can follow you, because I would be very curious to follow along. So
It's definitely going to be interesting.
cool.
Well, thank you very much.
You're welcome, sir.
And,
My pleasure. Glad to help.
I'm sure I will pick your brain again.
Please, by all means. All righty.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Definitely stuff to think about there. That's good.